In this video, we'll take a quick look at how to use the new render graph feature in Unreal 5.4. To automatically write out a shadow pass alongside our rendered beauty pass, we'll start off with a brand new scene, and we'll want to make sure under Edit, Plugins, that the Render Movie Queue is enabled. And then we'll have to restart Unreal to make sure that plugin is enabled. And once you've done that, as a test, I'm just going to start with a brand new basic level. So what we see here. And you'll want to make sure that you have your M Shadow Catcher material created from our last video. This will be the material that's a post-process material that will extract the shadows from our lit render. And we'll need that to set up the render pass that we're going to be creating. So if you need to create this material, you can find out more info on this and how to do this in our previous video, which is linked down in the description below. If you have this material already made and created, then you're ready to begin what we're going to be doing today, which is taking a look at Unreal's new render graph in the Render Movie Queue. So the first thing we're going to want to do is to create some sort of sequence or scene that we'll be able to render out. So I'm just going to create a couple primitives here. I'm going to create a sphere, a cone, and a cube. And I'm just going to take all those objects and place them kind of hovering above the ground and just kind of separate them so we have something that we can render. And maybe I'll rotate the light around to make the shadows face towards us. So if we look at this, this is what we're going to be rendering out. And to set that to render out, I'm also going to have to set up a camera. So I'm just going to look at this, and I'm going to go here and create a camera here, camera actor, and now I have a camera created from this current view. And I can look through that camera and kind of just frame that up a bit better. And that's what we'll maybe render out. So once I've done that, I'm also going to want to set up a sequence so we have a sequence to render out. So you may already be familiar with Unreal's sequencer, but I'm just going to go up here and add a new level sequence. I'm going to call it test. And I'm just going to go in here and add a new camera cut track, add our camera, and there we go. We have a sequence. So I can save that. And now we have a sequence that we can render out. So now we can go to Window, Cinematics, Movie Render Queue. We can add a new render, select our sequence that we want to render out. So it's going to be this test sequence that I just created. And there it is. And we're rendering it from our current scene, Untitled. So I should also make sure that is set to our current map. So I should save my map. Call it Untitled, okay. And just make sure that's properly saved here. Test, sequence, rendered under the map, Untitled. And we should all be good. So by default, you're probably used to using this where you can click on the name here under settings and get kind of a dialog box where you can add overrides, specify the resolution, where it's writing out the files, and a bunch of various other settings, what type of file you want to write out to, and how it's rendering, and all these options. But the render graph will replace that. And to use the render graph instead of that dialog, we're going to click on this kind of down arrow here and say replace with graph. Now, it is an experimental feature, but we'll click on that, and now we have a default render graph. So if we click on our default render graph here, we can view our render graph, and this is the default render graph where you have inputs, outputs, you have your global settings, warm-up settings, overrides, output settings, what resolution, what directory, and then you have your render settings. So what type of render it is, deferred render is rendering in lit mode. It's going to write it out as a JPEG sequence. And then you have the name of what it's going to render it as. So it's right now render layer, it's just called layer 1, and that will be our default layer. So this is kind of what you get by default, but we don't want to override the default here. We want to make our own render graph. So the very first thing we should do is go up here and do File, Save As, and save it as something new. You can save this anywhere. Maybe I'll just save it under my current content. and call it shadow pass graph, or whatever we really want to call it. It doesn't really matter too much. So maybe what I'll do is I'll save it just my render graph, because maybe we'll add more things to it. So I'll call it my render graph, and I'll just save it, and it'll reopen it. Now it's called my render graph. I'll close that. I'll switch this. So we shouldn't be using the default render graph. We're going to use our resaved version called my render graph. That's just so we don't mess up the default. We'll have a duplicate that we can play around with and not worry about breaking things. So let's first try rendering this out, and just make sure again that you have your map set here, your sequence. Check out your sequence to make sure there's nothing erring and that the camera's all defined in here. And if all that's good and you have your render graph here, that resaved render graph that we just did, and we click render local, you should get a window that pops up, and it will start showing what it's going to be writing out. And you can see that here, render preview, it's writing out the frames. And this is kind of what our render layer 1 is. It's just our beauty render of our current scene. And if I were to go out to the folder here where it's writing all that out, I will see all those files written out and saved. So if we go there, here's all my files, all those frames. So it's rendered everything out. And this is kind of what we normally expect, but what if we want to start adding additional layers? So this is kind of just our beauty layer. It's exactly what we're seeing in our viewport currently, like what we see here. But what if we want a more complex setup? We can start setting that up in here. So maybe as an example, let's start adding our shadow pass. So for our shadow pass, we can go here and write out another JPEG sequence. So I can add a sequence node. Now, maybe I wouldn't want it to be JPEG. It's probably better to have it be something that supports opacity or alpha, like a PNG, or even better, EXR file type. That'll be much, much more range stored and detail stored in the file, whereas a JPEG is very low quality and a lossy format with no transparency support. So I wouldn't recommend it, but we're just doing that for now as an example. And I can write out another JPEG sequence and just connect that up to the renderer here and start making modifications or doing things that are a little bit different, like overriding the materials or hiding certain objects. And those can be done with things called collections. So you can actually create a node called collection, and this node will allow you to collect certain objects and not collect or remove other types of objects. So we'll have to use this to set up our shadow pass. And if we think about what we're going to need to set up our shadow pass, is we're going to have to save out a new render layer. So I'm going to remove this collection pass for now. We have to save another render layer. So I'm going to search for a render layer, make a new node, and I'm going to call this render layer shadow. And this other render layer shouldn't be called layer 1. I'll call it beauty. It's our beauty render of just our full frame with all the shading and everything. Whereas this render layer will be just our shadows. So I'll take our deferred render and I'll write out a JPEG sequence called shadow. And I can't output that as the default layer. There can only be one thing connected here. So I have to make a new output. So I can go over here and add a new output and click on it and name it shadow. And now I can connect that up. So it's going to output two things, our beauty and our shadow. But right now, both these things are going to be the same. So that's where we start to run into some problems. Because technically what I need to do is somehow apply our post-process of this shadow catcher to extract the shadows from my scene. So you can kind of do that in here. I can go to deferred render, and you can actually add post-process materials. And by default, there's post-process materials here, and there's a couple that are added. There's like motion vectors and a couple other slots, and you can use those. You can disable them. I think by default they might be disabled, but you can add these additional post-processed materials and it will render them out or store them as well. But there's other problems that will cause our shadow pass to look wrong. And those things are post-processing effects, like maybe bloom or perhaps vignetting. Vignetting is the effect of darkening around the edges of the camera. And we don't see too much of it here, but it is affecting our scene. An example of that, I'm just going to go back to our render graph here. I'm going to just copy and paste this deferred render and connect this up like this. So I'm rendering essentially like twice. And one render is just doing our beauty render. It's rendering, storing it to a JPEG called beauty. The next one, it's rendering, storing it to a JPEG called shadow. But the reason why I'm creating another deferred render node is because we don't want those things like vignetting to affect the render that we're trying to extract shadows from. That may cause some problems. And I'll show an example of that. I'm just going to go on this separate deferred render node and remove all the post-processed materials. I'm going to add one. That's going to be our shadow catcher material. I'll enable it and I'll save this. And we're just going to render this out and see what happens. So we have one render that just has the default lit mode, saves as a JPEG called beauty, and then another render, deferred render, that saves out the default lit mode, but applies this additional post-process, which is our M shadow catcher post-process material, and saves it out to a JPEG called shadow. So let's try that out. We'll save that and write that out. So if we go and click render local now, it's going to start rendering that out. We see our window here and it says beauty and shadow, and they both look the same. So I'll stop the rendering for now, just so we can look at what it actually writes out. And we end up with a bunch of files like this. And if I scroll down, where's our shadow pass? Here it is. So it's writing it out separately. You can see it's test shadow beauty. And then the other one is test shadow.m underscore shadow catcher. And if we look at what it's actually writing out, okay, there's some issues. We got these blue weird edges at the corners. That's from the vignetting effect. The texture on the ground is kind of messing up our shadow extraction. So there's a lot of problems here. This is not a good shadow pass. So we need to fix those things. And that's why I'm adding a separate deferred render node. Because what we can do now is go in this graph, and on that separate deferred render node, I can go down under post-processing, set the vignetting to be disabled, so it doesn't render that effect for this pass. And there's other ways you can do this as well, but this is going to be the most simple. So now it should fix those issues, but now we still have the issue of the grid texture on the ground is messing things up. So for our shadow pass, we have to override everything with the gray material. So we're going to do that with a modifier and a collection. So we'll first start off with creating a collection node. We'll slide that in here after the JPEG sequence, and we're going to collect things from our scene. So I'm going to add a collection group. I'm going to name this collection, first of all, too. I'll name it all. It's going to capture everything. So under this collection group that I created, which currently uses actor names to select things, you could change this to actors and select specific things from your scene. But I think naming is a good way to work, as long as you're organized with your naming. And I can also use wildcards here, or certain kind of characters that allow me to select certain types of objects. If I want to select only objects with character or CHR at the start of their name, and that doesn't matter what the character name is, like character, wolf character, human character, whatever, I could just do CHR star, and then it will select anything that's a character, and then whatever text comes after that doesn't matter. So that little star is like a wildcard. It means all or everything after a certain point. if I just put that star in here like that, that's going to select all actors in my scene, every single object, every single thing. So I'm creating this collection called all, which selects an actor with any name, all names, doesn't matter what it is, just selects everything. And then we're going to take that collection and we're going to add a modifier. And this modifier we'll call, maybe we'll call it something like override gray, right? Override everything with a gray material. So we'll use that collection that we created. So I'll click here and I'll use my all collection that I made that selects everything. And then I'll say swap the material for everything to some sort of gray material. It would be best if I created like a white material or something, but for now I'm just going to use the gray ball material. That should work as a test. So now it's going to override everything to be a gray material, and then we'll write it out. And that way, we're not going to have textures on things for this pass, so it'll make it easier to extract the shadows with our post process. So now we're rendering without vignetting. We're saving out to a JPEG. We're collecting everything in the scene, all objects, all actors, overriding them with a gray material, and then writing out our shadow pass. And our render here is using our shadow catcher post-process. So if I were to save this now and then render it out, let's take a look at what we get. So we go over here and click render. Take a look at what it saves out. So very interesting. Now we see our beauty pass with all of our textures applied, and then our shadow pass, which still shows the lit beauty version of it, but you could tell that everything now is overridden with the gray material. And if we go look at the actual files that are being written out, so if I click here on this output, we'll be able to see all of our saved out images. We got our beauty render, and then we have our shadow beauty where it's overridden with gray. And then we have our shadow catcher render, which looks like this. So you don't see those lines. We don't have the vignetting issue. It's a lot better handled. Now there still might be issues with this. So it's not perfect. There's some coloring there. Maybe we can get rid of that. Maybe it's not really that big of a problem. But there's another issue that's going to be something that we need to take into consideration. So if we change the camera view, and I go into my sequencer here, and I angle the camera from more of a side view where we see the sky a bit more and our shadows. And we save that. And we go write this out with our render, our movie render queue. It's going to break our shadow pass. So everything's still rendering in gray, but you see the sky and the clouds. We see our sky dome, which has a gradient on it. And the problem with that is that that is going to make our shadow pass have this strange gradient like this with the sky. And that's a bit of a problem. So we want to exclude our sky box or sky dome from rendering. If I were able to go here and just hide my sky sphere, so SM sky sphere, and hide it. See if that works. I'm just gonna sky sphere, sky atmosphere, volumetric clouds. We'd want to hide kind of all those things. So if we were able to do that, that might solve our issues. So what we can do in our render graph is make that change on our collection for our shadow pass. We can add everything, but then add another group here, a condition, where we'll select our sky or objects that we don't want. So go to actor, and I can select my sky sphere. I don't think we really have to select the other ones, but we could do that as well if we don't want the exponential height fog or anything, or we don't want the volumetric clouds. You can select whatever objects you want here. You could select them by name, by typing in the name, but I'll just select them manually. And now instead of add, we're going to subtract. So now we're collecting everything, but subtracting these three objects. So those won't be captured. And then we'll override everything to gray and write out our shadow pass. And if I were to save this and then write this out, so now I can click render. And it still shows the sky here, shadow. Seems like we have the sky there. But if we go look at what it's actually saving out, let's finish. We can just click on our folder here and take a look at what it's saving. And we can see all our renders here. So beauty. Okay, it looks like the beauty. Then we have our beauty of our shadow override, so everything goes gray. We still visibly see the sky here. But if we see our shadow pass, the sky is no longer a problem now. So now that's kind of solved. Now you might be wondering why that works now for the shadow pass, when even the shadow beauty pass still has that sky visible. This really has to do with our own self-caused problem. If we look at our render graph, we had it where it collected everything and then overrid it to gray, and that produced an issue. But if we excluded our sky sphere from our selection, which is what we're doing now, we're subtracting it from our selection, we're getting rid of the sky sphere so that's not getting overridden with the gray material, and now it's working. And the reason for this is if we actually take a look at what's happening. If I actually take just an example to show, if I took a post-process volume and I made it infinite bounds on, I set the material to be our shadow catcher, this is what we get. Sky's not a problem. But if we took that sky and we overrode its material to the gray ball, well, now it's an issue. Now it's orange against the clouds. So it's kind of a self-caused problem. By making the sky override to gray, it produced this issue. If the sky was its default material, then it's not a problem. So technically the sky is still there. And maybe something that would be better is to actually totally disable the rendering of the sky completely. So it's not even showing up in the shadow beauty. And we can do that as well by creating a collection that just collects the sky and then hide that. So to do that, I'm going to go back to our render or movie render queue, open up our graph. So we render with our shadow catcher post process. We collect all objects in our scene except our sky sphere. And actually we could simplify this. We could just collect everything again, collect all objects. Override it to gray. Then do another collection. There's maybe better ways of doing this, but I'm just trying to keep this simple so we kind of understand what's going on. I'll do another collection. I'll call this collection sky only. And I'll add sky stuff only. So sky atmosphere, sky sphere, whatever part of the sky. Volumetric clouds, sure. All the sky stuff. And that group is now called sky only or collection. And then we're going to add one more modifier. And we'll call this modifier turn off sky. We'll say is hidden. Yes. What are we hiding? What collection are we hiding? The sky only. And there we go. So now collect everything, override it with gray, collect only our sky objects, turn them off from being visible. Now if we save this and render this, so render. Now we see our sky is completely gone in our shadow beauty. And looking at our rendered out files, we now see our beauty pass has everything with the sky. Our shadow beauty or lit mode for the shadow path has everything without the sky. And then our shadow catcher post process from that only has the shadows. So that gives us a bit of a shadow path now without really much problems. So now we kind of know how to start to set up our render layers. This can simplify things a lot because you can have it write out your beauty, your shadow passes, wireframes and other things all at once when you click render and have a lot of control over that through these node networks. Now this can get much more complex. You can have subgraphs, so graphs inside of graphs. You can add comments in here just like what you would do with blueprints. You have a ton of control in here to modify things, to make whatever kind of setup you need for your rendering. But this hopefully gives you a bit of an idea of how you can collect items and hide certain items or override their materials. So it gives you a bit of a way that you can start setting things up. And as a final note, if you're getting a bunch of errors like this or warnings that say missing expected render sub name format, all that's complaining about is not having this kind of token added to your file naming. So you'll usually run into this if you have multiple render nodes. And in some cases, you probably won't. If you're only wanting to render the sky separate from the primitive objects, you could just use one render node and do all this stuff. The only reason why we're using two here is just to turn off that vignetting effect or certain effects and be able to make that a little bit easier. But if you get that error, it's really just a matter of adding that naming to your sequence outputs here. So you can click on your sequence, change the file name format, and add that kind of token to your naming. So it would just be, we could go in here and just set it to render underscore sub underscore name dot. And there we go. If we put that on both of these, if we were to render now, we won't get that warning. And if you enjoyed this video, or if you learned something new, don't forget to like, subscribe, and if you're part of the Patreon, which there's a link to down in the description below, you'll also get access to the PDF for this video, which goes over all these steps that we went over in this video, and a little bit more in detail.